Part 1. The Beginning of the Rift. Somewhere deep in the green hills of Vermont, among the apple trees and old oaks, stood a house with a white porch. It had been built by Michael, the older of two brothers, a man with hands used to hard work and a heart hardened by duty. A retired military man, he put everything into this house, every board, every nail, every evening after his tour of duty. Linda, his wife, a woman with a soft voice and tired eyes, lived with him. Together they cared for Michael's parents, Edward, whose hands shook with old age, and Martha, whose memory was beginning to confuse yesterday with the day before. Every morning, the house smelled of freshly brewed coffee. The old dog Max barked at the squirrels outside the window, and the radio mumbled the weather report. But there was an air of anticipation in the air. Linda sometimes looked out the window, as if waiting for the sound of the engine that would bring her husband home. That morning, before dawn, Linda stood at the stove. She was wearing an old gray sweater, slightly stretched at the elbows. She stirred the coffee in the pot, watching the steam rise to the ceiling. Outside the window, dewdrops glistened on the glass, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the branches. Michael. Linda's voice was soft, almost pleading. When was the last time you took a vacation? I was thinking. Why don't we go to the lake? Just for the weekend. Michael sat at the table, thumbing through a newspaper. His fingers froze on the headline. He stood up, walked over to her and put his hand on her shoulder, gently but firmly, the way he used to hold a rifle. How can I, Linda? His tone was even, but there was steel in it. Dad can barely hear. Mom was asking where her school bag was yesterday. They can't do it without us. It's my duty. Linda lowered her eyes. She set the turbine on the table, and the coffee splashed a little over the edge. Her silence was familiar. In 20 years of marriage, she was tired of arguing with his duty. But there was a nagging in her chest. They didn't have children. She felt like a guest in a house where everything revolved around her husband's parents, and where she waited for the day Michael would return to her forever. Sometimes I feel like I don't belong here, she whispered, barely audible. Don't say that. Michael cut her off, but there was no warmth in his voice. You're my family. He didn't look her in the eye. He took the mug and went to the window, where Max was scratching at the door with his paw, begging to go outside. The day went on as usual. Edward sat in a chair by the fireplace, poring over old photographs. Martha hummed in the kitchen while Linda did the dishes. Toward evening, the lid of the mailbox slammed outside the window. Michael stepped out in his stompy shoes, expecting a newspaper. But among the papers lay an envelope with a military seal. He opened it on the porch, a summons. An emergency draft for a foreign mission. His heart raced. He squeezed the paper so that it crumpled in his fist. This is a mistake, he muttered to himself, frowning. I've served my... Linda came out next, wiping her hands with a towel. What's in there? She asked, her voice trembling with anxiety. They're calling me back, Michael answered, staring into the void. It's urgent. This is crazy. Linda raised her voice, stepping closer. You're retired. Tell me you're not going. Who else but me? He turned to her, eyes narrowed. They're calling for a reason. Linda threw the towel on the railing. Her voice trembled, but she restrained herself. She knew it was useless to argue. Michael had already made his decision. 3 days later, he was packing his suitcase. On the bed were pants, shirts, an old army knife. Linda stood in the doorway, arms crossed. What about your parents? She asked, her tone cold. I can't do this alone. I'll call Daniel. Michael answered without looking up. He'll help. He picked up the phone and dialed his younger brother's number. It took a long time to ring. Finally, Daniel's voice answered on the other end of the line. Dan, I need your help, Michael began, his voice firm, but there was a shadow of fatigue in it. I'm being summoned. My parents. Can you take them in? Of course, brother. Daniel's voice was calm, confident. Bring them. We'll be fine. Michael exhaled. He didn't like to ask, but he had no choice. Crossing to Colorado. Daniel lived in Denver, in a bustling neighborhood with high rises and the smell of coffee from cafes. His fifth-floor apartment was simple: couch, computers, books. He worked in IT, wore glasses, and preferred silence. His wife, Sophie, was lively, with a warm smile. An orphan since childhood, she dreamed of a family. When Michael brought his parents over, Sophie met them with a tray of cookies. Edward nodded awkwardly, and Martha hugged her, calling her sweet girl. Max sniffed the carpet and settled down by the radiator. "Michael, don't worry," Sophie said, her voice as soft as the morning light. "They'll be fine. I'll take care of them as if they were my own." "Yes, brother," Daniel added, clapping him on the shoulder. "Everything's under control." Michael nodded, holding back the lump in his throat. "Max, take care of them," he said to the dog, then turned to his parents. "Dad, Mom, I'll be back." He walked away to the car. Linda waited inside, looking in the mirror. The engine hummed, and they disappeared around the corner. Sophie stared after them, wondering how long she would have to wait for his return. A year and a half later, time in Denver was a different story. Edward was walking with his granddaughter, Mary, Daniel, and Sophie's 6-year-old daughter, in the park, teaching her to throw pebbles into the pond. Martha sat with 2-year-old Jason telling stories. Sophie made pancakes every morning. Martha loved them with honey. Max had taken to the couch. But sometimes Sophie noticed Martha looking out the window, as if waiting for someone. "I'm not alone anymore," Sophie whispered to herself, smiling. "I have a mom and a dad." Daniel came home from work and sat down with his father to play chess, even though Edward was confusing the moves. Life was going smoothly, until a letter arrived from Michael. It was short, "I'll be back soon." Sophie put it on the table, not knowing whether to be glad or afraid. Michael's return? Sunday. The morning was cold, with the smell of wet asphalt and a light mist over the street. Daniel was drinking coffee by the window when he heard the low rumble of an engine. He squinted. Michael's old black car pulled slowly up to the house. The door opened, and out stepped his brother, an older man with gray hair on his temples, wearing a worn military jacket that smelled like the dust of long-distance travel. His boots left muddy footprints on the sidewalk, and he held an old backpack that creaked with every movement. Michael's face was rigid, but a shadow of relief flickered in his eyes. He was back home, back to his responsibility. Max barked before Michael even knocked. The door swung open, and Sophie froze, holding a towel. Michael stepped inside, dropping his backpack at the threshold. He smelled of gasoline and metal, and his voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. "I'm back," he said, looking at his brother. "I came to get my parents." He leaned over to Max, patting him on the head. The dog wagged his tail, but didn't move away from Sophie. Daniel set the mug on the table, his fingers trembling slightly. "Brother." Daniel hesitated, searching for words. "They're fine here. They're used to it." "I didn't ask them to get used to it," Michael said, his voice sharp as a blade. "It was temporary." Sophie stepped forward. Her hair was in a sloppy bun, her apron stained with morning dough. She looked at Michael, trying to figure out how much he'd seen in this year and a half. "Michael, they're part of our lives," she said quietly but firmly. "Mary calls Edward Grandpa Boom because he coughs funny. Martha is teaching Jason songs. They are happy here." Michael took off his jacket, throwing it on a chair. His movements were abrupt, like a man used to giving orders. He looked at Sophie, then at his brother. "This is my responsibility," he said, clenching his fists. "My house is their house. I'm not leaving them here." Linda came in next. Her hair was disheveled from the long drive, dark circles under her eyes. She coughed, trying to get attention. "We didn't leave them, Sophie," she said, her voice shaking with fatigue. I wrote. Called once a month." Sophie parried, her tone colder. "I was with them every day." Tension hung in the air, but it hadn't come out yet. Daniel stepped toward the coffee pot, pouring another mug, more to keep his hands busy than out of any desire to drink. "Let's sit down and talk," he suggested, trying to sound calm. "You're just out of the way, Michael. Have some coffee." Michael nodded, but his gaze remained hard. He took the mug, but didn't sit down. He remained standing at the window, looking out at the street. Sophie threw a towel over the back of the couch and called to the children. "Mary, Jason, go say hello to Uncle Michael," she shouted into the apartment. Mary ran out of the room, holding the doll, and Jason waddled after her, clinging to her t-shirt. They stopped, looking at Michael curiously. "Are you the uncle who's gone far away?" Mary asked, her voice as thin as the tinkle of a bell. Michael softened, the corners of his lips quivering in a smile. "Yes, baby?" he replied. "I'm back." He crouched down, holding out his hand, but Mary retreated to Sophie. Jason just stared, rubbing the edge of his t-shirt. Linda tried to smile, but it was a strained smile. "They've grown," she said, looking at her husband. "You hardly recognize them, do you?" "Yes." Michael nodded, straightening up. "Time is ticking." Edward walked out of the bedroom, leaning on his cane. His steps were slow, but he smiled when he saw his eldest son. "Michael, son." Edward's voice was weak but warm. "It's good to have you home." Michael walked over to his father and gave him a brief, manly hug. Martha came in next, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face lit up with joy, but there was confusion in her eyes. "Michael?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Will you be long? I'm coming for you, Mom," he answered firmly. "We're going home." Martha faltered, looked at Sophie, then at Daniel. The silence grew thicker. Sophie pressed her lips together, but remained silent. Daniel set the coffee pot down, exhaling noisily. "Michael, let's take it slow," he said, trying to keep his cool. "They're just getting used to the new place. The kids love them. Why don't we think about it?" "I've been thinking for a year and a half," Michael said, his voice hardening. "They're my parents. I'm taking them." Linda stepped to the table, picking up the bag she'd left by the door. Her voice became sharper. "We're not strangers, Daniel," she said, clutching the handles of the bag. "We didn't drop them on you." "It was a temporary measure." "Temporary?" Sophie raised her eyebrows, her voice ringing with resentment. "A year and a half isn't a couple weeks. I taught Martha how to make my pancakes. Edward helped Mary with her crafts. It's not temporary, it's life." Michael set the mug on the table so abruptly that the coffee splashed onto the countertop. Max whimpered, feeling the air thicken. "Life?" he interjected, his voice like a hammer blow. "Their life was in Vermont. I was building a house for them, not for you." "And we were building a family here," Daniel objected, stepping closer. "They're part of it." Voices started to rise, but Sophie held up her hand, stopping the argument. She glanced at her watch. The time was nearing evening. "Enough," she said, her tone tired but determined. "Let's at least have dinner. I've been cooking all day. Let's sit down and talk quietly." Michael nodded, though his face remained tense. Linda silently went to wash her hands, throwing her bag back against the door. Daniel called the children to the table. The tension didn't go away, but shifted, like a cloud that hadn't rained yet. Dinner. Everyone sat down at the table. Sophie set out the roast chicken and a bowl of rosemary-scented potatoes. Linda was laying out napkins, but her fingers were trembling slightly. Edward was picking at the food with his fork, and Martha was trying to lighten the mood. "What a delicious chicken, Sophie," Martha said, her voice soft as morning mist. "You're good." "Thank you, Mother." Sophie smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. The word Mom cut Linda. She clutched her fork, her knuckles turning white. "I'm glad you two are so close," she said in a muffled voice, looking down at her plate. "But this is my family, my duty." "Where were you when Martha fell and shattered her knee?" Sophie looked up, her voice sharp. "Or when Edward got lost in the store?" "Stop it, Sophie," Michael interjected, his tone as heavy as stone. "We couldn't have been here. I was in the service." The voices grew louder. Jason whimpered, snuggling into Sophie's shoulder. Mary hid behind a chair, clutching a doll. "Maybe if you had kids of your own," Sophie threw, her words falling like sparks on dry grass. "You wouldn't be so obsessed with your husband's parents." Linda stood up. The table shook and the plate of potatoes fell to the floor, shattering with a thud. Max barked. She looked at Sophie, then at Michael, and walked out, slamming the kitchen door. Michael threw his napkin on the table and followed her out. Next day, the morning was quiet. Michael sat in his car, leafing through papers. He decided not to say any more. "Let the law decide," he muttered to himself as he started the engine. He drove to the courthouse. Daniel watched him from the window, clutching his cell phone. Courtroom, Michael and Daniel. Judge Hartman's voice was as dry as old parchment. 2 brothers. 1 family. 1 argument. Not about money, not about the house. About love and duty. The courts will decide. And so the rift began. The family, once strong, cracked. Max waited at the door. Edward and Martha were silent, and the crack grew. To be continued.